The Citadel of the Autarch was written in 1983 by Wolfe. Our final book in the Book of the New Sun tetralogy concludes at least the original story of Severian, following him through his most significant, weighty endeavors, as not only does he continue throughout the land outside Nessus, but he also deals with the fate of the earth as well. Starting this book, there's a sense of gravity. It's like you're entering a historic battlefield. It just seems important. The weight of everything that's happened in the context of this leads up to this book, and it's felt. There's also a welcomingness to this book. I read a book in between each of the Book of the New Sun's books, and even though I have my gripes with the prose, I felt welcomed back into it. I appreciated the identity of it. I felt myself relaxing into it. I think one of the things that sets this book apart from the rest of the series is its emphasis on war. From the first chapter in the book, Severian is surrounded by war. It's been referenced in earlier books in the series, but in this one it's omnipresent. A lot of his musings are on war, and most of the people that he talks to are directly affected and involved in the war. I thought this was really well done. I like Wolfe's depiction of war. I thought that he doesn't shy away from grim depictions of humanity, and that's really clear through his writings of war. Like a lot of the stuff he writes about, he uses the fact that Severian has really spent the vast majority of his life in a small corner of a small city in the world to comment on war innocently. He doesn't come at it with any sort of bias, and it's telling both of war and of Severian's character that even with his violent tendencies, Severian still recognizes the depravity and the sadness of it. One of the best recurring things about this series is Wolfe's wisdom. The series is a Bildungsroman, and I think that the reason that it functions so well in that context is that Wolfe has so much wisdom when it comes to how people operate. There's a point in this book where Severian's pondering his life and all the stories he knows and all of his past in a search of, quote, a key that would unlock all hearts. The most easily digestible thing that he comes up with is something he calls the primitivity principle. Quote, because the prehistoric cultures endured for so many chiliads, they have shaped our heritage in such a way as to cause us to behave as if their conditions obtained today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this quote because it sounds exactly like the basis of animism in my favorite author's works, Daniel Quinn, about how we need to respect the importance of our primitive roots. I digress, but Wolfe fills the pages again with Severian's brilliant musings. The next point I want to talk about is going to have some spoilers, so if you don't want to hear it, I'll put the links in the description as to when the spoilers start and end. I think one thing that everyone can agree on is that the Book of the New Sun is complicated. I felt like if I got through the series or the book and I understood well one single plot point or through line, or I took one thing out of it, I would be satisfied with my reading. And it's kind of reminds me of like when I would go to church as a kid and I'd listen to the sermon and I'd just kind of be falling in and out of sleep. And I'd be like, okay, if I can get what the message is by the end of it, or I can kind of have learned one thing, I'll feel proud about spending my time here. And for me, the message or the through line that I picked up on and was most connected to throughout the series was Severian's character development. The loss of his sword at the end of the last book was a monumental moment in his development. Probably the biggest part of his entire identity and his entire torturous upbringing was shattered. This book, he really grapples with his identity as a torturer. And while I think the doubts came up in the first 3 books, it's really this book where his doubts turn into actions. His shift is even directly acknowledged by him, where he says, quote, "It shall not be done that I did not do what I might to undo the harm I have done." Until this book, he's always introduced himself as Severian the Torturer or Severian the Lictor of Thrax or something along those lines. But in the Citadel of the Autarch, as it goes on, this changes. At one point, he just introduces himself as Severian of Nessus. Later, when he reintroduces himself to Vodalus, he introduces himself as, quote, Severian, formerly a journeyman of the Guild of Torturers. And when Vodalus asks if he's, quote, nothing else besides a former journeyman of that guild, he says no. This labeling is even important enough to take part in the very last line in the book, when Severian resigns to just calling himself, quote, Severian the Lame. It goes without saying that this change in title parallels a change in his moral code. From his disbanding of the Torturers Guild to even saying that he doesn't believe that it's right or doesn't know if it's right to butcher and eat animals, which is something that's even more radical than a lot of people in modern day think. To me, the climax of this series is in chapter 14, when he buries the claw. Quote, I had climbed to the bottom of existence and felt it with my hands, and I knew that there was a bottom, and that from this point onward I could only rise. I was an actor and no torturer. Even now, when he's objectively the most powerless and poor that he's been in his entire life, he feels free. For his whole life, he's been a torturer, which is essentially someone who has the power over life and death. And he rid himself of this when he stopped being lictor, and lost more of it when he lost his sword, but he still had the claw, which gave him power over life and death. Now that the claw is gone, he's got no power over life and death, therefore completing his attempt to leave that in his past. Later in the chapter, he introduces himself to someone saying, quote, I am Severian of Nessus, a wanderer. No torturer, no lictor. He's lost and he's a wanderer, but he's free. I honestly wish that it hadn't gotten into the Severian as the savior of the world element that it gets to near the end of the book, because I really liked when it was just a coming-of-age story for Severian. It doesn't feel like he needs to go to save the world. It's a beautiful story just talking about Severian. His progress in his development of understanding of the world is powerful, and it's plenty of a story in and of itself. Okay, spoilers over. The most asinine of my gripes has got to be Wolfe's stories, and by that I'm categorizing this as essentially the sidetracks where someone tells a story completely detached from the rest of the plot and what's going on in the book. There are like 4 or 5 chapters in this book that do that, and I absolutely despise them. There must be some importance to them. Severian even admits that he loves stories and the reader might not. And at a point, a person who told one of the stories is even dying, and they beg him to remember them because they're so important. So I get that they have importance, but it's just lost on me. I just don't get it. Like, a lot of this series, I get that I'm just probably too dense to understand, but they seem like boring, uncreative, irrelevant aversions from the already meandering plot of the series. This book, like the first 3 books in the series, is incredibly confusing. Reading this book is like when you go to a college lecture after missing one. It's like there's always this piece of information and this detail that you feel like is essential to your current understanding that you're missing. Maybe I'm outing myself as just not a very intelligent reader, but I think a lot of people just don't understand things in books, and they're like, oh, that's really cool. And they give the benefit of the doubt to the author. And me personally, I just sometimes in this series, I need Wolfe to throw me a damn bone. I think talented authors can, at least some of the time, clue you in on what they're trying to do, and to me, Wolfe fails to even do that a lot of the time. There's so much that I clearly missed on my read-through of this series. Like, the last chapter, I won't spoil what the title is, but it has some major religious connotations. And it just reminded me of, like, the whole religious subtext of the series, and I'm just like, oh yeah, I kind of just forgot about that. There's just so much to unpack in these books, but I just wish a little bit more was obvious or reachable on the first read-through. Also, speaking on confusion in books, can we just be done with dreams in books and movies and media? I am so over the dreams as a symbol trope. It is just so tired. Let's talk about this book being a payoff to the first 3 books in the series. This book relies a lot upon later payoff of things that were set up earlier on in the series. And I think something that people need to be okay with is, if you don't like that, that's a fine preference to have. If you want books that are more linear and non-self-referential, that's a totally appropriate outlook. Again, I'm sure that it does it better than I understood, but I just found myself during a bunch of moments in this book being like, man, I bet the scene will be way more impactful if I was really confident in my understanding of it and the scenes before. A lot of the payoff just really didn't hit for me. Like, there's this one scene later on in the book where a character from one of the first books shows back up for seemingly no reason, at least from my understanding. And it's like when you have a kid that's screaming at a restaurant and you're like, okay, give him his iPad. And you're like, hey, stop crying. Check it out. Don't you love this guy? You love this guy. Stop crying. This happens a lot. Characters show back up from the first 3 books and early on in the book, and scenes from the first few books are referenced, and while some of it was satisfying, a lot of it fell flat for me. When people recommended this book to me, they said that the reading of this book does not really start until your reread, and I think they were totally right. In conclusion, I was really ready for this series to be over, and you can either take that as 1, I was really excited to start my reread, or 2, I just didn't like it very much. I think it's a mix of both. This is not a standalone book. This is a hand-wavy conclusion to an already confusing series. That's not to say that it didn't have its great moments, though. Its depiction of war was brilliantly bleak, and Wolfe seldom goes more than like 5 pages without dropping some effortlessly wise meditation on life. Whether it was my fault or not, a lot of the payoff of this series just did not stick with me. However, this book did leave me feeling extremely satisfied with the conclusion of Severian's character arc, specifically his redemption. Love it or hate it, this book is a fitting conclusion to the legendary Book of the New Sun. Thanks for watching.